that information. I will now going to move on to introducing our guest speaker, Tina Kerr. We are honored to have Tina Kerr from MASA with us today. Dr. Kerr is a former Michigan Superintendent of the Year, and she brings nearly a decade of experience as a superintendent and more than 30 years of combined education experience to the role. She's a dedicated advocate for public school students, has actively served alongside instructional leaders at the local, state, and national levels on numerous educational boards and committees. Dr. Kerr holds a doctorate degree in educational leadership from Michigan State University and a Master of Arts degree in educational leadership from Western Michigan University. The Michigan Association of Superintendents and Administrators, MASA, provides technical, professional, and legal services to its members, in addition to government relations and services, publications, and professional and development opportunities. MASA serves public school leaders in nearly 600 public school districts and intermediate school districts across the state, helping the leaders of Michigan's most important public institutions get better results for our more than 1.5 million students. MASA's mission is to develop leadership and unity within its membership to achieve the continuous improvement of public education in Michigan.
Hello, this is Marcy Dwyer. I'm a member of the Michigan PTA State Advocacy Committee. And kind of be working with this presentation with Tina, we're going to be having a casual conversation about advocacy and children's education in Michigan. As part of the Michigan PTA State Advocacy Committee, my role is state legislative liaison. So for the Advocacy Committee, I'm one of the point people on Michigan education issues. Also on behalf of the Advocacy Committee and Michigan PTA, I connect to many stakeholders across our state on the importance of Michigan education. I am so pleased that Dr. Tina Kerr can join us today. She's a very strong advocate for children education in Michigan. She brings a wonderful background of education issues, and she's one of the leaders in fighting for better education for our children across our state. She and I are both our organization's contact people and members in an organization called Launch, which is a collaborative group that is working to improve education for children in Michigan. If you have any questions during this presentation or for Dr. Tina Kerr, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to handle what we can at the end of her presentation. And we'll try to follow up for those that we can't reach today. So to get us started, I'm going to ask questions for Tina, and I'm glad she could join us today. Welcome, Dr. Kerr. Could you give us your perspective, or what are some of the major issues facing Michigan education right now as PTA leaders are focusing on our state preparing for advocacy?
Well, thanks for having me, Marcy. And what an honor to be able to be a part of such a strong leadership group as the Michigan PTA. And I know we're going to talk about how important the PTA has always been in my career, but as we think about our priorities, unfortunately, we always have priorities and then a crisis or tragedy happen, and Michigan has been through a lot of crises. We had our pandemic, we had the tragedy at Oxford, so we've had to be very nimble, but there's still some kind of core items that we keep at the front of our work at MASA. So I'm going to list them real quick and then I'll just give a little bit more detail on that. Obviously, it was nice to hear from Mary Ann the explanation on funding. Funding is very critical and part of what we do in our advocacy work as well. But when we think about high quality education in schools, if they don't have the appropriate resources, we're not going to have that success. And I link funding to kind of our next major priority, and that's the educator shortage. Without appropriate funding, we're not able to be more creative in how we grow our own, how we recruit and retain teachers. And this educator shortage is something MASA has been working on for the past 4 years. And now with the pandemic, it's just been exacerbated as far as the need to have high quality educators. And I say educators, not just teachers, because we have shortage for our administrators in the buildings. We have a superintendent shortage. We have a bus driver shortage. The list goes on. So educator shortage will continue to be a top priority. It was really exciting to see that you're working on DEI, because when I came on as the executive director, that was really important to me as well. As we think about how things are in our country, in our communities, we added, actually, we call it JEDI because we added justice to that, because the idea that we do need to talk about racism in our communities, how we ensure that those students with diverse needs, their needs are being met along the way as well. And then a new kind of priority that we've added out of necessity and certainly a need is school safety. With the Oxford tragedy, we've seen this cycle happen so many times. When you had Sandy Hook, Columbine, unfortunately, the list goes on of the tragedies that occurred in regards to school safety. But when a crisis happens, we have a tendency to try and react quickly. And then a few months or a year down the road, it kind of gets pushed to the back burner again. So at MASA, we're really trying to create a comprehensive plan of how we educate our superintendents and our central office leaders to make sure that that school safety piece stays at their forefront. And we actually are putting on our first ever school safety summit in May. And we have our keynote is Natalie Hammond. If you do not know who she is, she was a teacher in Sandy Hook. She was wounded multiple times during the shooting. She is coming to Michigan to share her story and to really kind of help us process the tragedy that recently happened. But more importantly, how can we be advocates to ensure all our schools stay safe moving forward? So those are kind of our big picture ideas. And then kind of move back a month ago, you know what we were dealing with, Marcy? Now we have the Let Michigan Kids Learn voucher campaign. So we've had to scramble and shift our priorities and kind of make sure that that stays at the forefront. And I know you said you're going to talk a little bit more about it today, but we just launched our For Michigan Kids for Our Schools campaign on Wednesday. If you haven't seen it on Facebook or you haven't seen it on the news, please check that out, because you, the Michigan PTA, will be absolutely critical in us to ensuring that students do not suffer, because this campaign that the idea that they're pushing forward with the Michigan Kids Learn will pull millions of dollars away from our public schools. And again, Mary Ann just talked to you about funding. I just said that's a priority. We cannot have that happen. It will be so damaging to each of the districts that you live in, support, and work in. So I think we'll probably get to some more conversation about that, but that really has shifted our focus over the last month, because it kind of, we knew it was coming, but now we got to scramble and make sure it works. And the last thing, certainly, as you said, Marcy, Launch Michigan is a big part of what we're doing at MASA, getting our groups together to ensure that we're accountable for student success, that our students are performing at the level they need, and more importantly, that our state school system is fully funded to meet the needs of kids. So that was a lot really quick, and I know it's early on a Saturday morning, but you know me, I get excited when we talk about education.
Tina, more than excited. You are getting things done, and we're glad that your organization and that your work is dealing with so many of these important issues, especially when we talk about school safety, the teacher shortage. And we see that your organization is a connection point to superintendents and administrators on getting the background and what can be involved in these key issues. To our audience, we are going to talk more about this, what we're calling a voucher campaign. Others may call it the petition campaign from an organization called Let Michigan Kids Learn. So there'll be more background coming about that later on in this presentation. But Tina, in your work in terms of children education and advocacy, many of our PTA leaders come to their leadership roles at their local PTAs and PTSAs with no previous experience in communication to school administration or superintendents in their school district. Could you give us a little bit more about the role of a superintendent and their responsibilities?
Sure. So one of the things that we do at MASA is we train future leaders, right? We're training the next generation of superintendents. And we actually have put in our curriculum the importance of engaging with your community, but especially your PTA, which is that organized kind of advocacy voice of the community. So I don't always want to put it on the PTA. I'm really pressuring my members to understand how critical it is for them to engage in their PTA. Now, as a recovering superintendent, I put that as my top priority. When I first got to a district, I was like, okay, I had 3 elementary schools. I went and met with all 3 elementary PTAs because obviously they had their own groups and their own priorities. Then we had district-wide PTA meetings. I mean, I took it very, very serious about that relationship. Now, not all superintendents and not all communities were as fortunate as I was to have such a strong pipeline with our PTA, but it was critical that we built those relationships. So I guess for my advice, if your superintendent hasn't been trained by me and isn't wise enough to know they need to engage their PTA, you can always call me and I'll reach out to them and remind them how important that is. But B, don't be afraid to reach out to the superintendent. Generally, what we see happen is PTAs really have that one-on-one connection with the teachers in the building that they work with or that building principal. But as a superintendent, the superintendent can give you more of a global overview of everything that's happening in the district, because your work should not be isolated to just one building. You're working on behalf of the entire community, the school community. So what can you be doing to engage in different aspects that may not be in your own little bubble of that particular building? So that whole communication and reaching out, and hopefully every time someone reaches out to a superintendent, they're being very thoughtful and engaging and really trying to make that partnership work, because that's really how I see it. It is a definite partnership.
Tina, I like how you said your organization is training the next generation, and superintendents come to their role from different levels of experience. We often have heard from PTA leaders across our state that maybe someone in community A is having a certain kind of communication style and their superintendent has certain kinds of resources, but then someone in a different part of the state, community B, may not be having the same experience. Can you explain a little bit about superintendents' resources, their ability to communicate with the greater audience, and how the PTA can interact with that?
So every district and every superintendent and district leader is really coming from a different kind of frame of mind and a frame of resources. So for instance, I travel all over the state, just went to the region 1, which is our UP region, last 2 weeks ago, drove back in a snowstorm. Don't recommend that, but you know how those things go. But unfortunately for those superintendents, they're driving bus. They're having to manage their own budgets because they don't have access to a business manager. So sometimes for their priorities, the PTA doesn't get to that level that it really should be to be more supportive in their roles, because they're overwhelmed with the number of duties and responsibilities they have. Then you may go to an urban or a large district, and the superintendent has a kind of a slew of staff that work with them. And so the communication may be very different, and you may not get the opportunity to meet with the superintendent because they assign that to an assistant superintendent or a curriculum director. So really try and gauge what your system looks like, understand the issues that may be at play. And by that, I mean, what is the strain on the district? Do they have a major educator shortage? Are they scrambling for subs? The PTA can actually help in those situations because you're intelligent, smart, and you're a body that can be there to help our leaders when they're in crisis. And obviously the pandemic has created a whole nother set of crisis for our school leaders. I mean, if I hear mask mandates one more time, like I'm sure all the people on this call will, it's so frustrating that we've moved away from talking about what's best for kids and their education to, obviously we have some political issues. We're talking about mask mandates and all of these other things that really divert our focus. And the PTA could be critical in helping make sure we keep that focus where it belongs, and that's on our kids.
I have to say from personal experience, being a PTA volunteer for now over 18 years plus, it was an eye-opener for me at the local PTA level, starting to engage with my superintendent and the wonderful education they gave to our local PTAs on issues in education and their perspective, and even understanding our local budgets. I happen to live in Royal Oak, and our superintendent is wonderful, and she attends PTA meetings faithfully. When you were a superintendent or interaction you hear across our state, do you have any methods or suggestions of things a PTA could ask of their superintendent to improve this education back and forth and communication?
So I'm glad to hear that, Royal Oak, because that was my approach. I was pretty religious about making sure I was at every PTA meeting when possible. So one of the things that I would suggest is simply an invitation. So when I was a superintendent, I asked to be part of the regular agenda. So I would give a superintendent update or district update at the monthly PTA meetings. And that really kind of helped open doors to a more rigorous communication, because I'll use my previous district before I came to MASA. We were looking at grade leveling. So I can't see everyone on the screen, but I'm sure there were a lot of eyes that just rolled, right? A lot of people get very, very anxious about that because we're so connected to that home school where we live and we want that. But when we look at what was best in my previous district for the kids, we weren't giving them equal education due to the fluctuation of how they were located. So we were able to grade level. I never would have been able to grade level had I not prepped and continued to talk to my PTA, answer their questions, address their concerns, and that allowed us to have a successful transition with minimal disruption to student learning. So the PTA has always been and should be kind of that hub of getting the pulse of the community. My PTA helped with bonds. I was able to get a $25 million donation, and we talked about an aquatic center. My PTA was involved in those discussions. I mean, I really think superintendents would be missing the boat if they don't engage, but I do think the most important thing is to engage the superintendent as well. They may not be aware of the power that they really could and the influence that could happen when they build that relationship. So putting them on an agenda, say, hey, come in, do a checkup. If they can't do it every month, whenever they can. And then I like to make sure my PTA always gave me their member newsletters and said, this is what's going on, you know, that we're looking at. We talked a lot about making sure we didn't jump all over each other in fundraisers. I mean, it was just really a collaborative effort. So just making those efforts really will go a long ways.
You know, I'm so glad you mentioned the aquatic center in a particular community. So when we talk about advocacy and communication with the administration and superintendent, we're not only talking about advancing legislative affairs and this bill and that bill. We can talk about improvements to our education community locally. And so it's really good to hear of those kind of examples of interaction. I know that, you know, we have examples of some PTAs in the greater Detroit area that worked on arts or music education. Others on the western side of the state that have worked on community involvement and how to get more of the community engaged, maybe in study chips for children or resource programs or volunteerism. So it's nice to hear that some of that conversation can be had with your local superintendents and administration.
Can I jump in real quick, Darcy? Marcy, just on that point. So in my perfect world, if I were able to pick what I thought a PTA should look like and function like, you're exactly right. What has a tendency to happen because of the lack of funding and resources, we go to the PTA and say, hey, we'd like this new playground equipment, or we'd like this, or we'd like that. We don't have the money for it. And boy, those PTAs come together, they do their thing, and we have something contributed. If we can fix our funding in Michigan and systemically change it, wouldn't it be amazing if our PTA then became coaches for young children that were struggling, and we really tried to expand the PTA's influence on education in the classroom instead of about it being a fundraising group or a group that would help us advocate for a bond passage, which we still need those, but really getting for the PTA, because if I think about the PTA presidents and the leaders I've worked with over the years, I would probably be encouraging them right now, hey, how much education do you have? Will you go back and be a teacher? Because we have such a shortage. And these are loving, caring people that have experience with kids, know what schools are about. Why wouldn't we be using our PTAs more to help us with students that were struggling and use them as that resource? So in my perfect world, I would love to see us eventually have our PTA be that right hand to the teacher or be in the classrooms doing more work to support student achievement instead of just doing the great work of, hey, we need this for our kids. Can you help us get that? So that's my pipe dream. I thought I'd just share it with you, Marcy, because you know how I am.
I share that It's not about playground equipment. It's about advocating, and let's change the word advocating for asking, dialogue, involvement with your community, with your schools, with your children and future children's education. So as we are getting kind of near the end, and we're thinking about that PTA leader that may be new to advocating or dialogue with their superintendent or dialogue with their state rep or state senator or federal legislatures. So maybe they've never ever spoken to a political person about an education issue. What might be some of your advice to that PTA leader, and think even all the way to the average PTA member about advocacy and involvement?
So the first thing, attend things like this, right? You're getting information, you're learning as you go. So these are wonderful opportunities that you're putting on for your leaders. Then I would also say, ask around. We typically would see, I was fortunate, my PTA president, I think she'd been there 20 plus years, and her kids had finally cycled out, but she just was so passionate about it. And I used her as a coach for the succession planning of our next PTA leaders. So we kind of made it a real effort to ensure that we had leaders in positions, and then gave them the resources and the training they needed to be successful in that role. So I know that's what you do at Michigan PTA, but sometimes people don't know that or don't know what's available to them. So definitely ask, learn from others, contact your Michigan PTA group, and then don't be afraid to reach out to the superintendent administrators. Ask them what they need from them. Everyone has a different style. So they may have one need in one district, and the other district it looks different because their style is different and how they utilize and kind of rally the PTA behind their efforts as well. So doing both of those things, but then also just continuing to have the courage. These are volunteers who give up a ton of time, make a commitment to the kids in the district. So have the courage to know who you're representing, which is children who typically do not have a voice with the legislature. You're the liaison between the legislature, your district, and kids. So maximize on that. Use that power that you so have been given and that you've earned, and use that to your advantage to help students. So those are just a few tips. I'm sure if we had more time, I could sit here and talk about education and how wonderful PTA support is, but I know we got to keep moving.
So I have a couple questions, and again, to our audience, if you have any questions for Tina or about advocacy, please put them in the Q&A. One is, again, maybe for that new person. I've never spoken to our superintendent. How do I find that person's contact information?
Well, it better be on the website. Usually, I mean, even for me. So after today, if someone has a question or they want to talk to me and tattle on their superintendent and say, hey, I reached out to them, they ignored me, I'm happy to help advocate for you too. But typically it's right on the website. I post my cell phone. I posted it as a superintendent. I post it now as an executive director. I believe in full transparency and making sure that I am accessible anytime that's needed. So you can certainly find it there. Then just go for a visit. Call the superintendent's secretary, go introduce yourself. That's the best way to really kind of build that initial relationship, is to introduce yourself. I can't imagine any superintendent in this great state having a parent who's passionate about kids come to their office to introduce themselves and them to blow them off or not, make that gesture, return them as well. So don't be afraid to go, call them up. I know everyone's busy, but sometimes that face-to-face interaction really goes a long ways versus an email or a phone call. So those are a couple ways to get to the superintendent.
So I know that often as PTA leaders and their members come to a meeting, they have questions about school improvements and school budgets. And maybe every particular person has a particular pet project or a favorite, or I think we should do this. Could you just give us, and I know maybe it's hard to make this a brief answer, background about school improvements, budgets? Can superintendents help explain that? Is it the superintendent or the school board when we actually get down to that local spending?
So I could really confuse you and talk about all the edgy jargon that we have, a DIP, a SIP, those are all district improvement, school improvement. Certainly I would hope that a superintendent would come in, and again, I was on the monthly agenda, and each month I would bring a different topic or a different issue. And a lot of times the PTA would tell me, hey, we want to learn more about this state aid funding. We want to learn more about X. So just making sure that you have questions too, that does help the superintendent ensure that they're staying on topic and giving you the information they need. But we live and breathe it. I mean, school improvement has actually, part of what we do at MASA is we do strategic action planning, which is school improvement. And we've really tried to simplify it, because if you think about the state's requirements for the DIP and SIP, which are these big documents, a lot of times our PTA members and our community members are like, what? We don't understand this. So we've tried to really make sure that we talk about school improvement on a much more universal level, and we get away from some of the edgy jargon that's included in that. But Mary Ann did a fantastic job presenting the budget and kind of explaining where money goes. I would add, I know she mentioned MEPSPERS, our retirement system. That is really important to us, because unfortunately it's a system that is broken right now. And for every dollar we spend in schools, 63 cents goes to try and help fix that. Think about the kind of money that we could have if we could actually get that system working. And Marcy, you know, we're looking at ways and launch to try and fix that, because that's money that's getting pulled away from the classroom. But we have to have that in order to attract and retain our teachers. So.
Tina, I have one of the questions from our audience. Thank you, Triana O'Neill, for a question. Her question is, how would someone get advocacy training? I'm going to let you answer it from the superintendent and administration level, and then I may chime in and answer from our local PTA level for PTA leaders.
You know,
Again,
yeah, go ahead. I get what you're saying.
Yep.
So a lot of times superintendents, when we talk about grassroots efforts, that's where it starts. It starts with the parents, starts with the PTA and that community piece. Now, as a superintendent, I typically would go when I knew we had to kind of rally the troops, like we're having to do right now with this anti-voucher campaign. We would talk about what does it look like to advocate and inform when we're talking with legislators, other parents in the community, so forth. So we kind of did our own little training of what that looked like. But to be honest, I think the best place to go is to you, Marcy, right? I mean, that's why you're doing these types of things. You've had people that have been successful. You've got advocacy at the federal level. Those are all great ways to do it, but just more of a grassroots. We typically encourage superintendents to spend some time and talk about what those conversations would look like with their leaders and their PTAs.
Thank you, Tina. And adding to that, from the local PTA level, Mike did a wonderful job from our advocacy committee of identifying some of our training tools. But we at the advocacy committee are happy to do personal outreach. Your starting point will be Jen Garland, our vice president of child advocacy. I know Jen's contact information is at the bottom of the agenda, but an email, a phone call, and Jen can help personally connect you to the resources. You may end up working with one of the members of the advocacy committee, but we are happy to come out to your PTA board meetings, to your PTA local meetings, and do more about getting engaged with advocacy. And I know that I have Tina's commitment and helping you connect to your superintendent and administration if you feel that they need more training or more information on how, you know, education can be talked about, what we can do with grassroots.
Marcy, do we have time to answer Kelly's question that's in the...
Yeah, let's go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, so right now for the School Safety Summit, we have that available to central office leaders, school resource officers, school board members, principals, community liaisons. So that's kind of where I think if your question, but mainly what we're looking at is other members too of a safety team. So this first summit, we're trying to train a district team. So as the president of your PTA or the work you're doing in your community, find out if they really have a safety team, because that's the other thing we're working on is making sure every district does. But to your point, Kelly, that what I really want to see happen as we see this as being a year-long continued training process, I will certainly get with Marcy, because it's going to be critical to have that community voice, because when we're in crisis, parents need to know what happened. I mean, I can't imagine being a parent in Oxford and getting that call of what was going on, but I might feel a little bit more comfortable if I knew what the process was. And that's really what we're trying to get to. What is the first step that you should be doing as a district leader? How does that relationship build with your school resource officer, your local police department, et cetera? So this is our first attempt to do something that's more long-term and engaging. And I absolutely will make sure moving forward that we have that parent voice and we can include that in this work because it'll be critical.
So Marcy, I want to interject. I have a question that has come to me via text.
Thank you.
The question is, how do PTAs engage again with schools in the post-pandemic world? How about that? Define the universe and give 3 examples.
I think, isn't our time about up, Marcy? I think I'm gonna go ahead. It's nice to meet everyone. No, all kidding aside, you know, it depends a little bit on what's been going on in your community. I can't give you a carte blanche response. I can give you some thoughts and ideas, but what I'm really concerned about, what has been the general feeling in the community during the pandemic? So many communities have been really divided in regards to what's been with the masks, with the vaccinations, all of these types of things. So I would approach it depending on the climate and the culture of your particular committee. Again, I would start at the building level, reach out to your building administrator. If you're working in a particular group, if you have 5 elementaries and you're 1 elementary PTA, reach out to all 5 building leaders. Then from there, start to build that relationship, start to get re-engaged in post-pandemic work and how we move forward. The other thing to keep in mind, I know that the pandemic has been difficult depending on your district, but we have some districts that have never been virtual, that they have been in session the entire time. So I think that re-entry and that engagement will look very different than maybe if your school has been like Ann Arbor, you've been virtual for almost 2 years. So very different approaches. So look at it that way, but engage first at the local, kind of that building level, then move to that superintendent or that central office level and start to reach out and build those bridges. But those building principals really will be advocates and liaisons to make sure that they are supportive of you getting re-engaged in your district. So it'll be different depending on where you're from. So sorry if that didn't completely answer what you wanted, but just, you got to make the attempt and make the effort. The sooner we can get back to our new normal, the better it's going to be for kids. So you need to do that outreach for sure.
And Tina, I like the conversation of the new normal. You know, I'm hearing that a lot now, but we realized that this pandemic brought to our attention that there were differences across our state.
There were inequities, right, Marcy?
And so some communities were really never virtual. They just didn't have the resources. They didn't have the structure. And so they had to navigate through this in a different world than maybe in Ann Arbor.
Yeah,
and I know that you at the state level are looking at all communities. Likewise, us at the Michigan PTA state level are looking at all communities and all children and that connection point.
Well, I know you talked about advocacy, Marcy. One of the other advocacy things that may not be in our top priorities is broadband access, right? It's actually sad that right below the bridge in Region 2 has less access than we have for our students in the UP. Most people think the UP doesn't have it. We have to have a statewide system. And again, it goes back to the pandemic exacerbated the inequities that exist from one zip code to the next in the state. That's why I'm part of Launch. I want to change that. I want every single student, no matter where you live, to have the same opportunities, the same access to what their peers or their colleagues do across the state. So this work is going to continue to be important, and it takes a strong voice from those grassroots efforts like the Michigan PTA to help us do that. So I appreciate all your work as well, Marcy, and being an advocate for kids across the state.
I want to build a little bit more on Kelly's question, which was, you know, engaging with your event in May, but going back to school safety. And again, if any of our audience has any more questions, we probably can handle 1 or 2 more as we conclude. As you'll see later in this presentation, we're going to be highlighting some of our priorities for the Michigan PTA at the state level and the legislative area, and school safety is one of them. not only Tina's organization, MASA, but many other organizations you heard other advocacy committee members mention, are we engaging with in terms of the topic of school safety? So Tina will be made aware of all our priorities. I know that she and I will find opportunities for interaction between the PTA and her organization. It may not be that we have a table at her May event, because as she was explaining, that might not be that first audience, but future interactions in terms of bringing more school safety awareness and education and suggestions and connection points will occur. So that is something that's happening year long at the advocacy committee level. If any member of the PTA, as a member, as a leader, is interested in any topic that they see collaboration between other organizations or going further with involvement, please reach out to Jen Garland, our vice president for advocacy, and she can help make those connections. So Kelly, I hope we're answering your question in that we are always looking for opportunities for the PTA to engage at the state level and then bring down that engagement to the local parent family level whenever we can in working with organizations.
So Marcy, I want to add too that we're not alone in this safety summit. We're partnering with MASB, which is the school boards. We're partnering with secondary school principals, the intermediate school district. So I think what you and I will want to continue to work on, especially as I think about MEMSPA, which is the Elementary and Middle School Principals Association, that's going to be an easy connection there of how can the PTA partner with MEMSPA, with MASSP, and of course us moving forward to ensure that they're getting that support and training. So we try not to operate in isolation. We try and collaborate with all our ed orgs. And of course, we've always considered the PTA as one of our education partners as well. So we'll keep working on that question and certainly that support moving forward.
Thanks, Tina. Again, thank you, Kelly, for your comment. I'm glad that we're speaking on this, but this and all issues are very important for children, entire children across our state in terms of education. I know Tina and I have addressed that there's a lot going on, but I'm really thankful that we have collaborative partners in working on children's education. It all comes back down to the advocacy at the local community level. I cannot say how both of us are more excited that there are very involved and wonderful people who are stepping up and being a voice for all children. And that will start with your outreach in your local community, communicating with your superintendent's administration, communicating with your state reps and state senators. And we are here as a resource for you to help at any step of the way. Tina, do you have any concluding comments you'd like to share?
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for your service. All of you that are on this webinar, those that are going to hear this webinar later, from the bottom of my heart, as a former school administrator and now working at the state, we can't do it without you. And as I know you're going to hear more about with the anti-voucher, I implore you to use the power and the leadership that you have to help us with this and help every single kid in Michigan. Because if we do not defeat this voucher campaign, it will have long-term ramification on every single kid that we serve together. So I appreciate the tireless time you put into being a PTA advocate and a leader, and I thank you. And I just implore you to stay involved and be vigilant in the work that you do. So thanks for having me. What a great Saturday morning thing to do. So I appreciate it.
Thank you very much to Tina and Marcy.